Okay, so welcome to our November webinar. We are so excited. It's almost holiday time, so all the crazy things are going to happen with the holidays coming, right? Including Susan and I. We're a little crazy, right, Susan?
Yes.
All right, so today's webinar is actually going to be fairly short. We think it's packed with some good information, but we're probably not going to keep you more than like 30 minutes or so. But you can see we're going to give you some feedback on the child count that we collected a few weeks ago. We have some further information on spoken language interpretation guidelines, otherwise known as an interpreter at an IEP meeting. Some common enrich errors we're seeing. Susan's going to give us all the webinar feedback from October. She's going to go over some positive behavior support information. Then we have our usual additional stuff and some virtual sign-in information. Jam-packed, exciting webinar this month. So the child count feedback, first thing what we noticed is there were quite a few errors with the certification forms that you all submitted. And that was mostly that maybe our numbers were off 1 or 2 in some cases. I think we had one that was off like 10. Mm-hmm. Just remember on that day, in order for the children to count on the child count, everything had to have been finalized in Enrich. That includes evaluation, reevaluation, IEPs. Everything has to be finalized in order for those kids to count. So some of the common things we saw were people asking about, well, what about those going through initial evaluations? Well, they wouldn't count on your child count. They have to have been evaluated and receiving services. Students who had open evaluations, but if the team had determined eligibility, that didn't count. Because again, they have to be eligible, receiving services, and have an IEP. So some of you were asked to do a new form. So if you were sent one and you haven't sent it back, please do so as soon as possible. Just so we can have that for our records and we have current counts. So the other thing to remember are students who exited or withdrew the day of the child count, they did not count, right? They had to be there as of that day. So for next year and moving forward, and for those of you who have been with us, you'll notice it was a little different this year in the fact that I didn't send you your number. I purposely did that because I wanted you all to see what the number actually is and how we find it as well. So I know for some it was a little bit of a pain because we kept sending you new forms or the numbers were off, but part of that was to make sure that you all knew how to run those reports, you knew what children to include on your count, and all of that. So in the future, we'll continue now to just send you your form like we did this year, and it will be due the end of the day of the child count day. So for next year, when you're doing this, make sure, one, that everything is finalized and current in Enrich, and you should do that before the deadline date. So you might want to do that, a day or two before the actual child count date. The report in Enrich, run it at the end of the day, not at the beginning of the day, because what if somebody does withdraw or whatever? So you want to run that at the end of the child count day. That form is not due until, we say by close of business, which, 5 o'clock. But if you get it in anytime that day before Susan and I wake up the next morning, then you're good. I mean, I know some people like to work late and maybe we'll do it at 10 or 11 at night. That's your choice, but we won't look at it until the next day. So, you basically have all that evening to do it if you need it. If you're having problems finalizing something, then please reach out to us immediately. Don't wait until the day of the child count. Let us know beforehand, or, if it's something that morning, there's an emergency, that's fine, but typically we should be looking at finalizing and make sure everything was finalized prior to that day. So just for your information, our final child count this year was 2,346. That's the number of students with disabilities we have in our district across the state. Pretty large size. I'm going to guess we're still below, I don't know our total population, but I'm going to guess we're probably still below 10%. We don't really over-identify kids, which Susan and I really appreciate all the hard work you do with your schools. That is up, though, 69 students from last year. So we have seen an increase. But if you take that 69 students, you multiply by all of our 34 schools, that's really not a whole lot of students per school. So I still think we're doing a good job in identifying those that really need it. And as we've talked about before, so this is the count that we'll use for your school's IDA funding allocation next year, right? This count is what's used for your funding for the following year. So within the next week or so, we'll also be sending out emails for those students who are identified as multiple disabilities. Some of you had gotten a request from me for some auditors we have to define that, but we'll send out some more because we need to know what their disabilities that make up that multiple disability, so we know under what category for your funding purposes. Since multiple is not a category that gets funding, it's the individual disabilities. So this piece is really exciting, right, Susan? We're very excited about this.
Very exciting, everybody.
Very exciting. We actually were at the fall admin meeting yesterday with the Office of Special Education Services, and they actually put this in our folders, and y'all, they laminated them. That is how important the state feels that this is.
I even got 2.
Yeah, Susan was special. She got 2 laminated copies. I got the cheap folder and only got 1 laminated copy. So we know who ranks in this district. Anyway, so Susan sent these out, I think, was it like a month ago or a couple weeks ago?
No, it was an odd, because I verified, because I forget if I do send things out, sometimes I do them in my mind and I don't really actually do it, but I verified. It was sent out in early mid-August, and it was also in the operator's notes in August, and it was also posted on our website in August.
Okay, so this was sent out in August, but we realized, obviously since, OSIS made kind of a big deal about it by laminating it, that, it'd be good for us just to take a few minutes here to review it with everybody. So, the guideline document and the script was issued for IEP meetings that require a spoken language interpreter, otherwise known as an interpreter. I don't know why they say spoken language. I guess
probably not to confuse it with a sign language interpreter, yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. But Susan did post them on our Google site, so make sure, you download the script. It's pretty helpful, actually. You can print it and use it. It kind of keeps things moving along. Like she said, she emailed those out in August. They were, I guess if I had read, Susan, I would have known you did that. They were sent out to you all, and they were put on the website, and then she also put it in the operator's notes. So really the purpose is that obviously IEP teams, you have to ensure that parents understand the proceedings or the meetings. So if that requires an interpreter, then it's the responsibility of the school to provide one. Okay, so a good interpreter is one who is proficient in English as well as the interpreted language. In most cases it's Spanish, but every once in a while we run into a couple that aren't Spanish, and they tend to be a little harder to find. They also should be knowledgeable of the IEP process and possess an understanding of cultural differences. So this really is not just anyone who speaks the language. This is not the attendance clerk or someone, an assistant in a classroom who speaks the language but has never been to an IEP meeting, doesn't know the student, doesn't know anything. It's not just that. So you have to be very diligent when having your interpreters, right? You just can't pick someone to come do it. So, to kind of keep moving the meetings along, these meetings do typically tend to go longer. Pause for the interpreter to translate, make sure the interpreter has access to the documents before the meeting. One thing, I've seen, not here in this district, because, we don't attend as many meetings, but in my previous districts, when we have an interpreter, it'd be like, okay, the special ed teacher would talk a few sentences, then the interpreter would talk, then the special ed. And yeah, it was like painstaking. So, you don't want to do that. You want to kind of move along. You want to have conversation with that interpreter prior to the meeting, talk about the IEP, give them access to that, and kind of what the plan for moving the meeting along is. Otherwise, you can be sitting in these meetings for like 3 and 4 hours just for pure interpretation. Okay. If a student has ESOL services, then that ESOL teacher or a school psychologist should be invited to the meeting. Right? We want someone there who is an expert in training and second language acquisition, who knows the process. So it is highly recommended that at those meetings, you do have the ESOL teacher or the school psychologist for those students who are receiving ESOL services. And again, OSIS has issued that script. You're happy to use. You're welcome to use it. It's expected by them that we are utilizing that script during those meetings. So download it, print it. I mean, we do have 2 laminated copies. I mean, they just may be door prizes at our January face-to-face. You never know. I mean,
also, as Laura said, in her previous roles, it was a lot more common having interpreters present. And I would say the same was for me. And one thing that some schools did to manage the time better of all staff being in the meeting is, since if the school provides the interpreter, that the school pays for that interpreter. Well, sometimes schools would say, hey, can the interpreter and the parents come in advance of the meeting and go through the documents together? Because a lot of times they need to be translated. And it's like that best practices of parents having a draft in advance. And the parents would meet with the interpreter in advance, and that interpreter would just be translating the document so the parents could think about it, write notes to themselves. And then in the context of the meeting, it would go a lot smoother. So that's also a helpful tip.
Yeah, I agree. Anything you can do with the interpreter and the parent to kind of move that meeting along and just to make sure they understand. It's also a great time if they do meet for that parent to ask questions, general, but it would be a great practice to get into. I totally agree. And I don't know how many we have going on. It'd be interesting to find out throughout the schools, but here's some guidelines when you have it.
But if you guys need more information or have questions, just let Laura and I know.
Yeah.
And the link on the website is the link directly to those documents, the guidance document and the script.
Yeah. So some common enrich errors just to keep you updated. So far this year, we have now worked on 234 enrich ticket requests to date. Woo! That's a lot of enrich for Susan and I.
Well, it's double for me since I'm not gifted in enrich.
No, that makes it double for me because Susan will say, Laura, can you fix this one? But that's why we're a team. Works good. So we're still seeing some common careless errors. We're seeing wrong items attached in files, deleting items that didn't need to be created. So please make sure that all your staff are trained and they're attaching the right things and they're labeling them and they're creating the right forms and clicking the right buttons. I know it seems like little, but that is stuff that does take up a lot of our time. There are some days, as you know, we do these tickets twice a week, typically Mondays and Fridays. I think we're going to probably move that to Wednesdays and Fridays, just because there's not a lot that are coming in right now over the weekend. There were in the beginning, but now it seems to have slowed down. So I think we're going to move it probably to Wednesdays and Fridays.
Yeah.
But those are things, there are days that when there's a lot, it can literally take us almost all day to clear these. So anywhere we can be proactive and get these careless errors fixed and not have them would be great. So a common error we saw this month was that we've gotten lots of emails and tickets about not being able to finalize initial or reevaluation. Many cases, it was because many were starting a process as an initial and then choosing maybe a reevaluation on the eligibility determination or vice versa. So there's only one way to fix this, and that's to create a new one and delete the wrong one. So be very careful when you're choosing the option. If your psychologists are doing it, be sure to train them and they are choosing the correct option. So let's say you're really doing let's say you're doing an initial meeting. So you're going to do the referral planning form. And then when the psychologist or whoever does the eligibility, they have to make sure when it asks them the reason, they're saying initial. For a reeval, you're going to do the reevaluation review, not the referral planning. That's where a lot of errors seem to be happening. So one person's clicking referral planning, the psychologist is clicking the reason for the eligibility is because of a reevaluation, and Enrich isn't reading those two processes saying, wait a minute, you started with one and now you're doing something else, so it's going to give you an error. We've seen that quite a bit this month. Mm-hmm. The other thing we've seen, one of the other things we've seen a lot this month is that we can't end a student. You go to end a student and then it says this little red box, unable to end, or I don't remember the exact words. but that typically means there's an item in the programs that is dated after the exit or withdrawal. I'm going to show you this in the system here in a minute. So what you're going to do is you're going to go into view history and look at the start and end dates of items. You'll see immediately what the date is and why it won't close. In those situations, you guys don't have access to fix that, but at least if you go into the view items and let us know when you fill out your ticket, it makes the process quicker for us so we know exactly what item we need to go in and fix. Another error is the system is requesting an action like eligibility or evaluation reports. That means that somewhere along the line, an incorrect process has occurred and can't be deleted without locating the process error. So when we see those things, that's where Susan and I have to go in. We always start with view history, and we kind of have to put on our CSI hats and figure out what happened. You know, where did this go wrong? Again, if we can get our teachers to make sure they are clicking the right things and paying attention, I know things get busy. I know in the beginning of the year it was crazy, but now that we're into November, we should all kind of be a little more, and so should our teachers, a little more proficient with this. So I'm going to get out of this screen here, and I'm going to go into Enrich. Tell me when you guys can see this. Can you see the Enrich screen?
Yep.
Okay. So if I go in, if I'm in a program of a child, you can see right here this little button that says View History. If you click this, it's going to show you everything that's been done so far in the program in terms of programs. So when I say look at start dates and end dates, these are the dates I'm referring to. So sometimes you'll see a date here, especially in a reeval we've seen, maybe the team met on 8/22/19, but by accident when they hit the outcome, they dated this 3 years out. So if somebody goes to end that child, it's not going to work because we got a date that hasn't even occurred yet. So that's typically the problem when ending students. When I talk about the reevaluation review, and this was actually one we had to fix, this actually was done as a referral initial, but when we went down here to the eligibility, the psychologist clicked eligible reeval. So you can see where it wouldn't, when that happens, the system's going to throw up an error because it's reading it as an initial, but now you're saying it's a reeval. So the only way to fix it is to go back and to delete one of those. So I just kind of wanted to show you where that was in Enrich. We canceled our monthly, we really weren't doing a monthly, but our last Enrich webinar, and we will go ahead and reschedule that. And that's really just a time for people to call in or log in or whatever we do with Zoom, whatever you want to call it. And we, share our screens and we go through any issues and people can ask questions and we can take you through a process. So we'll get another one set up before Christmas. And we'll send you out the date and everything. So now I'm going to stop talking and Susan's going to start talking.
The purpose of having these slides is because this year we started the virtual sign-in, and many of you guys are giving us good feedback from those virtual sign-ins or asking just general questions. So this is to show you guys we are reading them, we are looking at them, and we are following up on them. And then also to kind of hone in on so you're aware of what other people are thinking. So just very quickly, the child count was a big feedback component. A lot of people even were surprised about prior written notices in our discussions last month, meaning that they're given after the meeting concludes, not prior to the meeting, even though it says prior, and that parents have to have them in hand prior to implementation. If anyone needs additional information or support from Laura and I, please let us know. Also, that annual review meetings, the effect, even though they must occur every 364 days, not 365, it's 364 days, and that the date that you go by for that count is the date the meeting was held, not date that the IEP starts. And so look at that. That seemed to be a good verification for some folks, but also new information, it seemed like. We had a lot of discussion, or I should say Laura did a lot of discussion on COSIF. And again, the link to the website where all of our information on COSIF is in there. And then Laura already talked about allocations. And we did get a lot of really good positive feedback on the session on self-determination and how that impacts IEP goals, programmings for students, just general discussions with students. More will come this year on self-determination, but if you have anything in particular or specific that you need, make sure you follow up with us. And that was good feedback, Laura, don't you?
I do.
So our high leverage practice today, last year, we did a lot on behavior discussions for 1 or 2 months. And today is kind of getting more specific. And when we look at behavior, last year, we talked a lot about positive behavioral supports and behavior management. And there is a discrepancy, there's a difference between discussing how you discipline and how you manage behavior. They're two very different things. And I always love, I love this little picture saying, "Dear teacher, I talk to everyone. Moving my seat will not help me." That is kind of saying, you know, there's nothing we can do to curb that behavior, but there really is. When you look at discipline, the definition is there. It's the practice of training people to obey rules or adhere to a code of behavior. And a part of discipline is a punishment component to make them obedient.
And that was me in school. Moving my seat would not.
It still is.
Yeah.
And management, oh wait, can you go back? Management is more or less looking, are you going to go back to the other?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. And then management is looking at the process with dealing with things or other people. There's the word controlling there, which is part of the definition. I don't really like that component of controlling because we are not controlling. We're more guiding or curbing behavior. But management is what we're really focusing on when we're looking at positive behavioral supports. That is not to, you can go to the next slide, Laura. That is not to say that schools' disciplinary codes are wrong. They have to have them. They're part of their general management structure. But when you look at discipline, there's the consequence component. And instead of just focusing on the consequence, there has to be positives or incentives. So when you look at the definition of behavior, it's a way that a person acts or conducts themselves, either within themselves or towards others. So just general reminders, everyone has a behavior. We all have them. Some of them are very positive. Some of them are not so positive. Some of them, you know, we hide and we know as adults where, when, and how to do them. And in an educational model of looking at supportive behavior, we primarily hone in on how behavior impacts the learning of self or others. There are some student behaviors that might be annoying to us staff, but they don't impact the learning of self or others. And a prime example, which 20 years ago was never allowed, is students standing up in class or having rockers as chairs. That was never allowed 20 years ago. Now it's much more common and it's much more allowable because it really doesn't impact the learning of others. It's just a different way for kids to get some energy out. When we look at data collection, this is really funny. It says, "I started to add anecdotal notes about each student's behavior to my grade book, and now the book is too heavy to lift." I think that is the thought process about data collection. Anytime people hear it, they're like, thinking they just have to collect it all the time on every child. And that is not true. You can go to the next slide, Laura. Data collection shouldn't look like that. It shouldn't be papers of data collection of student behavior all over the place. Anytime you decide to collect anything other than what you could observe and that's in your memory and be meaningful, you need to make sure that data collection is targeted, specific, and purposeful. It shouldn't be random. It shouldn't be a fact-finding mission. You should already know in your mind what you're honing in on and who might be assisting in that data collection. Okay, the next one. So when you do data collection, do not collect data unless you're going to use it for something. You're going to look for patterns. You're going to look for trends. You're going to look at progress monitoring, which we do in a lot of cases. For some reason, staff view data collection for behavior as a separate entity than what we do with math or reading or writing or you know, yeah, math, reading, or writing, that's what I'm going to focus on. But usually data needs to be in those parameters of how we view academics also, because behavior impacts how students do in all those other academic components. So don't collect it unless you think it's going to be purposeful and there's a reason. You look at patterns, trends, and progress. Also, do not collect behavioral data unless you're going to use it for something. How often are we asked to do something for people and then we never hear about it again? So when you ask Mrs. Jones to help you collect data on Susan, you're going to tell her what it's going to be used for. Okay. So when you do that, you need to share the data, what you discover, with parents, staff, and then in the context of IEP meetings, and sometimes in the context out of IEP meetings. But definitely you would do updates in IEP meetings as you're collecting information.
And don't forget, if you're collecting it and you're doing an FBA, we need parent permission to do that.
Oh, yes.
That doesn't mean that every time you collect behavior data, you need parent information, especially if you're collecting it for like progress monitoring or things like that.
Or targeting for a goal, because you need a baseline data for a goal.
Right.
But yeah, if you're going the realm of an FBA, you need consent.
Yep.
You should go through a reevaluation.
Well, you actually don't have to do it as a reeval anymore. You can just get consent for it.
Well, I think, yeah, so legally you don't have to, but when you look at it, if you know that there's nothing else impacting the child and you're very clear that it's a certain types of behaviors that you need to know the function of, then yeah, but I always think it's a good process to sit and say, let's look at it a big picture. Make sure we rule out some of those other areas.
Right.
But yes, you're correct, Laura. So when we do data collection, identify the behaviors. So be simple and don't make it so complicated, especially when we have babies who have very problematic behavior. It seems overwhelming. So I would think it's always a good practice to start brainstorming behaviors you're thinking of. And then when you get if you can talk to staff, or if you're doing it in the context of an IEP meeting, you would prioritize what behaviors you're going to target first. Because if you have 5 behaviors for a kid and you're targeting all of them, it is an uphill battle on what's going to work and what's not, because there's so many variables. So if you have Johnny who's getting out of his seat, you have Johnny who's talking out in class, you also have Johnny who's hitting other kids, I would think that Johnny hitting other students would probably be more priority than some of the others. Not to say you can't be aware of them, but when you're looking at data collection and honing in, it's important to prioritize. When you need to define the behaviors. When Johnny's screaming out in class, what does that look like? Because when I say it, it can mean something different for me than Laura. So am I going, "Ugh," and just yelling and it's over, or am I screaming for 5 minutes? It's two different scenarios. So you need to make sure that the behavior is defined in observable language and it's measurable. People, when you describe it, people can kind of see what's going on for themselves without actually being there. You also, when you collect data, you need to collect it across different settings and times. This is especially important when you look at settings in middle or high school or even elementary when they're changing teachers. And this is not saying a teacher may trigger a student, but maybe it's a certain subject or a class dynamic. So you need to not just collect data on Susan during reading class that's at 9 a.m. every day, because that may not depict Susan's behavior throughout the day. Also, looking for patterns, going back to that first bullet, if you go across time, maybe behavior is really good in the morning or manageable in the morning, but in the afternoon it's off the charts. And that would give some indication of the child is losing their threshold. They're hitting their threshold and can't manage themselves. Then also you look at types of data collection, and typically the 3 types are frequency, duration, and intensity. Frequency is indicating how often it is occurring. And you wouldn't look at it a whole day span. You would look at it at a 10-minute span, maybe a 15 or 20-minute span periodically through the day, and you would define what that looks like and how many times that incident is observed that you're looking at. Duration is how long the incident is occurring before there's a break and then they stop. And then intensity, we have students who do behaviors that are not frequent and they don't last long, but maybe the intensity of them is so severe that it needs to gain attention because it's inhibiting that student's learning or the learning of others. So those are typically some of the things that we would look at when we're looking at data collection. And Laura and I have heard some of the general requests that have been going around and looking at just some templates for some of these data collection devices. And so by the end of the month, we will have some templates for frequency, duration, and intensity. That does not mean you have to use those. Those are just tools that you can use to create your own or ideas, or if you choose, you can use them. Laura, do you have any more information on data collection?
No, I think you did a fantastic job.
Did I nail it?
You did.
Okay, communication with families. This made me giggle out loud. He says, I wouldn't say your son is a bad child. He's gifted at disruptive behavior. So that is the art of wordsmithing something. And when we talk with families about their child's behavior, immediately when parents hear behavior, they automatically think it's going negative. And just saying behavior in general should not be a negative term, but nowadays it really is. But we also need to be wordsmiths in how we relate what we are seeing, what our concerns are to parents without talking at them or without making parents feel like they're being accused. If any of you have children and you've gotten a phone call like I have, you know, from the school, you automatically get on a defense the second the conversation starts. So as educators, we really need to wordsmith how we're representing this information to families.
It goes back to that old saying, it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
100%. So the next slide kind of just outlines in general, parents are resources. We cannot automatically assume parents are encouraging behavior, designing behavior that we are seeing that's impeding the learning of that child or others. We have to use them as a resource. So the conversation should always occur. We are seeing this, and you get specific of what you're seeing. Do you see similar behaviors at home? Just because they say no or yes doesn't mean there's automatic conclusions drawn. A lot of times parents will say, we don't see that at home. Well, but demands of what's going on at school are not the demands at home. But some intensive behaviors typically you will see across the board, but it's just good to get that information from parents. Also, you might want to know, are demands placed on the child at home? A kid who's an only child versus 4 kids at home, those demands may look different. And again, not saying that we are putting certain judgments on families, we just want to know the structure. Because if a child has never had clear expectations and demands placed on them, except in school, we would probably anticipate certain types of pushback to what those demands are. And it's just insight of how we can approach it together. When the student is frustrated, how do they respond? So you can talk to parents about that. Say, when I'm asking Susan to do X, a lot of times I've seen she shuts down. She's not looking at me. She looks down and she's not responding to me verbally. When she gets frustrated at home, how is she responding to that? And that's a good rapport to build because you're using parents as an asset. What works for them? What doesn't work for them? Be careful of wording and terms. We just talked about that. Do not use absolutes. Don't say Susan never listens or Susan is always off task. Don't ever write that in an IEP either or on a progress report because it's very vague, it's not interpretable, and it means something to me that it may not mean to you. Use very concrete examples. So some examples, instead of saying Susan never listens, you may say, I've noticed that when I give directions for an assignment, Susan is talking and does not hear the directions. So you're saying that she's not really listening, she's doing something else, but you're not drawing conclusions, you're just saying what you saw or what you see. Or instead of saying Susan is always off task, you may say during independent reading time, Susan has been prompted to start or continue reading X amount of times because she is preferring to draw in her notebook. So those are very different ways to state similar things without cutting a parent off from listening. Also, communicate in a manner which you would expect if it was your child. So just make sure you're careful about how you word it, and always make sure that it's a reciprocal conversation versus it's just telling the parent what's going on and that they need to do something. Okay, Laura, any additional information?
No, I think the last thing is just key. Just remember, sometimes we get frustrated with parents and students and stuff. and we do things at meetings, or they say things that we may not really mean, or didn't come out the way we want. I mean, just always go back to thinking about, if this was your child, how would you want this team to behave or act if it was your child?
Yep, absolutely. So when conversations are had with gen ed teachers or special education staff or administrators with parents, and it involves a child with an IEP, we need to make sure that if it's an isolated incident, that's fine, because we don't expect more out of behavior out of students with IEPs than general ed students. But if it's a pattern of behavior and it's a chronic discussion, we need to make sure that the IEP is documenting the concern regarding the behavior. Period. It has to be addressed in the IEP if it is preventing the student from progressing or preventing other students from learning. You can click on the next slide, Laura. So those are areas within the IEP or part of the IEP that can be addressed. We're not saying they all have to be addressed, but if behavior is a concern, it needs to be addressed. If under consideration of special factors at the beginning of the IEP, one of the boxes under those special factors is behavior. If the student has an FBA or a BIP, that would need to be referenced. If the FBA is a year old and the child didn't need a BIP, that may be up for debate if it needs to be referenced, but you need to see if it's still a factor in their programming, okay? If the student has anything like accommodations or goals, and if they have goals, they would have services regarding behavior, it must be addressed in the consideration of special factors, and it must be addressed in the present levels. So I have seen, and I'm sure Laura has seen in the past, where a student has a behavior goal, but nothing is under consideration of special factors. It all has to flow together.
Yeah, and that was one of the things from our audit. We had a lot of IEPs where students, there was clearly behavior issues in the present levels, but it wasn't addressed anywhere else, or special factors wasn't checked. So that's huge to make sure it follows through the IEP like everything else.
And if you do need to have a behavioral goal for a child, make sure that the goal is worded in a positive way, like, you know, they're going to increase their time on task from 4 minutes to 5 minutes or something like that. Obviously, it has to be based on data you've collected because there has to be a baseline. But don't say that they're going to, you know, have 2 referrals instead of 5, because it's making it okay for them to have a referral, or that they are going to keep their hands to themselves. It needs to be worded in a positive way, and it needs to be worded of what the child can control.
And the other thing to remember is, where people forget, is that a child who is acting out and misbehaving, so to speak, is not going to go from doing this consistently to all of a sudden not doing it at all. So, you know, you wouldn't want to have a goal, we'll go from 95% to 0. I mean, that is just not realistic when it comes to behavior. So what you all as a team need to decide is, what are the behaviors you can live with? You know, what are things we can teach this child to do in place of it? And what are things that you can live with? Because it is not going to go from 100 to 0. No way. And behavior, typically, I'd say 99.9% of the time, as you start to put in, strategies and everybody's doing the same thing, behavior is going to increase before you see a decrease. So, you know, this is something that's going to take time. It's not something that's going to just go away overnight. It's going to take time. It's going to take consistency. And most kids will up the ante before they realize that, you know what, this isn't going to work.
That's a really good point, Laura. It's also making sure, it goes back to that point of knowing that you're collecting the right data and honing in on the behaviors that need to be addressed. So there really shouldn't be any need for a student to have a goal about assignment completion or referrals or anything like that, because that's not the behavior. There's something else that the student is doing that is resulting in referrals or resulting in them not turning in the work. So make sure you're honing in on the behavior, and then and like Laura said, it will technically spike, or you're going to go through a pattern that's everything's going great and like a full moon week. And you know what? Some people mess up and then they have to get back on board. So that's very good. Once we've talked about how to collect data, how to hone in on the behavior, how to address it in your IEP. Remember, behavior is just not something a special education teacher deals with. A student is a gen ed student first. So a student with an IEP is a gen ed student first. And across the board, staff needs to be supported to support that student. And typically it's the coordinator that does that in some capacity, and a lot of times also could be administration. So you need to be looking at what are the needs of your building, what are the needs of the IEP team to understand what's going on. And that, like the picture shows, just because you covered it, it doesn't mean they learned it. And so if you see holes and certain staff not really being able to or not supporting a behavior intervention plan, I would always err on the side of what support or what training or what information do they need to do so. That's also the case with accommodations. So just because you did your training at the beginning of the year on special education information doesn't mean a teacher knows the ins and outs and logistics of a specific kid's program and how to support that. Laura, you can click on the next one.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
So different ways you can do that is, which all of you guys do these things, is consult with a staff member individually if it's one staff member or as they come to you. And don't always think that they're going to come to you. You may need to seek them out if you see concerns or if you see an area that needs to be clarified. Professional development, it can be targeted by a certain grade level, a certain subject, or as a whole building. And then also on challenging cases, maybe where you're looking a lot at behavior, and this isn't exclusive to behavior, it could be academic too, but a pre-meeting and then a follow-up with staff may be required to see what concerns they have or where things are going. But that is a support component and mechanism for staff that sometimes is really needed, and sometimes we're looking so much of how we're interacting with parents and the kid that we forget about the staff themselves. Okay, so if you guys need additional information in this area, please let Laura and I know, because we know, especially this time of year, behavior starts spiking up, and we're hearing I'm hearing a lot of things about manifestations or making sure we're counting kids, suspension days, things like that. Just a reminder, do not take it personally, be calm. We are the adults in the room, and this is a child. Adults cannot be triggers for students. All behavior has a function or a purpose, and we need to find it, and it can evolve through time. And Laura said number 4 was a great point. Be consistent. Also, kids with certain types of behaviors can be very challenging. No one is questioning that. Make sure data is driving your decisions, not your feelings at that point. It's very hard to disconnect, but it's really important. Dead man's test, I think this is your term, Laura. I hadn't really heard it until you said it, but if a dead man can't do it, it's not a behavior. So you need to be careful on how you describe it and how specific it is. And then also, we don't expect more from students with IEPs or students with FBAs and BIPs. We don't expect more from them than the rest of the student population. So look at them as a group of the whole, treat them like a gen ed kid first, because they are, and then from there we hone in and intervene. So if you guys need, I know there's always more hunger for different things on behavior. If there are specific components, please let Laura and I know, because we are here to support and help. And then there'll be some sample collection documents on the website by the end of the month.
So just some basic additional information. Just remember some things. When a meeting is rescheduled for any reason, you have to do a new notice of meeting, and that has to be sent to the parent. And make sure you're doing your contact logs of why the meeting was rescheduled. Okay, so make sure you're filling those contact logs out as well. Those are great ways to document anytime you meet with a parent or talk with a parent. And if you just don't finalize them, you can keep a running contact log all year and finalize it at the end of the year. So it's a great way to keep things in the system. And there are times where we've had situations where Susan and I have had to become involved, and we've asked for the contact login, there's nothing in Enrich. So make sure you're utilizing that function. It's a great function. Like I said, you can just save it and not finalize it, and then you can keep a log all year with a parent. Remember, if a parent doesn't attend a meeting, be sure you're clicking that little box on it that a copy will be sent home. That was something we did get hit in the audit 2 years ago. Sometimes that wasn't identified, so make sure that you are clicking that a copy will be sent home. CGI submissions, we are working through them as quickly as possible. You've seen emails come out. Our goal is to provide feedback to all the submissions that you've done at this point prior to the Christmas holiday, if not sooner. I think Susan has a sooner timeline than I do, but you know, she's a little bit quicker than me, I guess.
Not on a lot of things though.
Yeah, so our goal is to have everything back to you, including the audits and looking at the IEPs and all of that prior to the Christmas holiday. So be on the lookout for those. I think at this point we've definitely gotten through all of the IDA policies and procedures. We're slowly working our way through the credential. And then also keep in mind, we also have the same stuff we're doing for 504. So that's why it's taken us a little bit of time. Just as an FYI, tomorrow, both Susan and I will be attending the board meeting here at the office. So we won't have any calls. You can email, you can text. You know, we will have that, but we won't be able to actually step out and talk or anything because we do have the board meeting. We also are wrapping up our first on-site visits of the year. So we've been around. It doesn't sound good, but we have been around the state. If we haven't gotten to your school yet, we'll be there before the Christmas or holiday break. Like I said, we're trying to get all these in to at least have been there the first half of the year, and then we'll probably make another round to those, you know, in the spring and stuff. So, you know, we definitely want to get out and see everybody at least once this year. Sometimes we'll come out more often if we need to. So just be on the lookout, and we'll shoot you an email and let you know, and, you know, make sure that you're going to be there and things like that. So the virtual sign-in, this is the link you'll click to complete that you watch this webinar. So you fill that out. If for some reason you can't make the live version, that's fine. We understand, but always complete the virtual sign-in, even if you watch it after we post it, and we do post them within 24 hours. That way we can see who's watching the webinars and who's not. It is expected as part of your job that you do watch these webinars. This is where, as you see, we communicate most of our information. We offer some training support. And it will answer a lot of your questions sometimes before you even ask them. So make sure after you view this, you do go ahead and fill that out. I will post this once it downloads. I will either post it this afternoon, or if not, it'll definitely be up by tomorrow.
And I've already posted the link. So under each date of the webinar each month, it will say recorded webinar, PowerPoint, and virtual sign-in. I've already done the link to the virtual sign-in, so it's directly on the website also.
So there you go. If you've watched this now, if you're participating live, you can go in and fill that link out as soon as we're done. And there are a few questions, and that's where we get that feedback from. So we know kind of how to guide these and offer further support. So at this point, that's it for us. Are there any questions from you all that you can put in the chat box to everyone that we can answer?
It's crickets, Laura.
I know, it's kind of like when you're at a meeting and it's that uncomfortable silence where you're like staring at each other. Okay, Fran, what's your question? Yes. The behavior plan, the FBI, everything, if it's through the IEP, is done through Enrich. So Fran's question was, should a bit be placed in Enrich? And the answer is yes. Everything for our students with disabilities is done through the program.
And if a student has a behavior intervention plan, if you're meeting to review the IEP, that behavior intervention plan is part of that programming and should always be discussed and addressed in some way.
And actually, you'll notice when you do a behavior intervention plan in our Enrich system and you finalize it, it will put up on your chevrons. It actually will make it red. That's something I added, well, I think after I came a couple years ago. And it's just a reminder, an easy visual reminder that, hey, this child has a BIP. So you want to make sure when you're meeting, you review that BIP. So friends, next question. So behavior is considered a disability. Well, not just behavior, Fran. They'd either have to be identified as a student with like another health impairment or emotional disability. It's not just because they have a behavior that they would be considered a student with disability. They still have to meet one of the 13 categories of eligibility. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And at this point, if nobody has any other questions, I'm also going to stop recording it so we can get this out there on the support site. All right, y'all. Well, if you have anything or you think of anything after, you know, you can always reach out to one of us. We're happy to help. We're happy to answer your questions. But if not, that'll end this month's webinar. Oh, one more thing we didn't mention, we will be meeting in January on site again for a winter face-to-face meeting. We haven't gotten that scheduled yet, but when Susan and I are both here tomorrow, we'll look at some potential dates. It's typically like the third week in January after the holidays, after everybody gets back and is back for a week. We ask you all to come. Remember, attendance is required for all of the coordinators. You know, lunch will be on your own. We're looking forward to it. We have some fun ideas of stuff and things that we're going to go over. So be on the lookout for that in the newsletter with the information about the date and stuff. But it will be here in Columbia. Anything else, Susan?
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.